Hey class, my name is Sean Slay and I am in group 6 with Ryan Copeland and Skylar Johnson. Today we are filming our final video review that will be covering modules 4, 5, and 6. Now, based on the feedback we received from our last video, we have decided to incorporate slides into our presentation to better assist the visual learner and to aid our fellow students in following along. In Module 4, we discuss the relationship between engineers and corporations. Engineers as managers, engineers as laborers, and engineers in politics. Engineering reflects and reshapes social contexts. Prior to 1880, businesses were mainly family firms, proprietorships, and partnerships. They were small in scale and common. Meanwhile, corporations were mainly used for large projects such as canals and railroads, and they were less common. However, as technological systems grew in complexity and scope, corporations became more common. Businessmen lobbied to make corporate growth easier, and eventually corporations seemed to be in control of everything. Corporations are able to raise money needed to hire top engineering talent to work on large projects to create products that consumers wanted, and this continued their cycle of growth. In 1925, 75% of workers are employed by corporations and government, and in 1965, only 5% were self-employed. It was common for engineers to become managers. In fact, from 1900 to 1930, 66 to 75% of engineers were in management positions within 15 years of graduation. As this became more common, management theory was included in engineering education, and management changed because of engineers. As new technology was developed, it changed labor practices. Frederick Winslow Taylor created scientific management as a need to make jobs more efficient through the elimination of inefficiency. Scientific management used 4 steps. It broke tasks down into simple steps and attempted to analyze each task using scientific analysis. Scientific method was used to train. Workers were closely supervised, and work was divided equally between managers and workers, where managers planned and workers executed. The assembly line was another method that came about to make the labor process more efficient, and it was made famous by Henry Ford. By moving the work to workers, time was reduced and workers were only needed to focus on one task at a time. It took 6 years for the production of the Model T to drop from 12.5 hours to 93 minutes. And this dropped the cost of the Model T from $950 to $250 in about 17 years. However, because of the monotony of the work and the strict adherence to a schedule, the pace of work was frantic and it wore people out. The Charlie Chaplin satirical short Martyred Times depicts a worker being fed by a machine while he continues to work. Herbert Hoover's time in politics was advocated associationalism, where voluntary cooperation between businesses and government was key. Herbert Hoover was elected president in 1928, and within a year the Great Depression happened. He hoped that associationalism would stimulate the economy, but it was largely unsuccessful, and by 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. His focus was on technocracy. Technocracy advocated for technical experts to be in positions of power instead of the traditional leader. The Committee of Technocracy was formed by Howard Scott and others to push the idea of technocracy as a solution to resolve the Great Depression. Even though it was a popular idea, it never came to fruition because they couldn't agree on a path.
5 discusses engineering in the Cold War. The Cold War started in 1945 and ended in 1991, and it was between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States, towards the end of the Cold War, did not demobilize their military in order to keep a strong presence against all the other nations to show them that they're not someone you'd want to mess with. Both sides had a lot of powerful weapons that none of them really used all that much because they didn't want anything to really happen. They were kind of just asserting their dominance. The Cold War ended in '89 with the teardown of the Berlin Wall, and the Soviets disbanded in 1991. The module then starts discussing how the United States was during World War I. The United States Navy was not a big navy whatsoever. They only had a couple ships, and they weren't the greatest in anyone's navy whatsoever. A lot of money was spent during this time, in between World War I and World War II, in improving the Navy, Air Force, military, infrastructure, all of that stuff. Leading into World War II, they had a lot more planes, Navy, military ships, nuclear bombs, radar, and other weapons. The MIT Rab Lab was where the engineers and scientists made most of these projects and other military items. The U.S. bombs increased during this time from a few to 30,000. The space race, stage projects, and satellites is what this module next moves into. The space race was between the Soviet Union and the United States once again. The Soviet Union beat the United States into orbit, which did not settle well with the United States. John F. Kennedy spent a lot of money and time in investing into the space production nowadays and was able to get a man on the moon, Louis Armstrong, within 8 years. Satellites during this time in the Stage Project were not necessarily one of the greatest features of this timer. Both of these did not seem to work very well because of how quickly everything was changing, but satellites were not able to keep up with the days. Jay Foster was one of the main people that were trying to get the Stage Project to work well, but his efforts were just shortly disbanded. People argue that a lot of money was spent on the Cold War, which could have gone towards education or healthcare, but then on the flip side, a lot of people argue that it made the United States the nation that it is today.
Hello everyone. Leading into the final module with Module 6, we encounter the conundrum of politics and algorithms and whether or not they are beneficial and who they benefit. We discover that algorithms can be used for good as tools within society to lessen the human burden of repetitive tasks. We also discover that more often than not, they are used as money makers, such as in search engines, where they direct your attention to their paid advertisers' information instead of the best information that could be presented. Many of these algorithms have made headline news for showing biases towards certain groups from the developers of the algorithms. Facebook, Google, Yahoo, etc. are examples of how social media and search engine algorithms display only information that is relevant to their pocketbooks instead of the best answer or information that could have. We also came across the expansion of women and minorities in the engineering field from the beginning of the class and to the time of the Erie Canal. Women and minorities increased in engineering fields up until the early 2000s, and research showed that the trend has stagnated or even dropped off a bit. After another enlightening thing we came across in Module 6 was the allocation and disposal methods of electronic waste or e-waste. When at times we thought when we were recycling our electronics, they were actually being broken down and components being reused. We discovered here that many times that was not the case at all, and they end up in a poorly designed landfill or foreign country, leaching the toxic chemicals and heavy metals into the soil and water systems of local communities. Not to mention the ever-increasing amount of power consumption from computing devices to perform such things as mining for Bitcoin. All of these things have a negative impact on our environment, but is never brought to the forefront of our attention. This concludes our presentation for Modules 4, 5, and 6 with Sean Slay, Ryan Copeland, and myself, Skylar Johnson. We want to wish everyone good luck on their final exam as we close out the course.